Friends, we are starting. My apologies for being a few minutes late. As you can see, the excitement has overwhelmed us at times. But I just want to say thank you so much for being here today for this event. And of course, thank you in advance for the work you and we will be doing to change the planet, because this is what this event is about. I have a few speakers that are going to join me on stage. I'm going to invite them on now because they're all celebrities and I want to be part of this discussion. First, Dr. Marjun, please. We go back a long way. I still remember meeting Dr. Marjun in Guiyang years ago when I was invited to speak at a green finance event, and he got up and did a presentation, and I said, oh my God, he's stolen all my words, he's fantastic. And I wrote a blog about it afterwards, my new hero. I hadn't even met him at that point. But of course, since then, we've worked together on many things, growing green bonds, the Green Finance Task Force. Of course, he has gone on to become a legend. He is, as you would know, the chair of the China Green Finance, I always forget the full title, committee, the co-chair of the IPCC Taxonomy Working Group, previously the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, and of course, also helping lead Hong Kong Green Finance Association and many other titles. I won't go into them if that's okay by you. I have next Kenneth Huey from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Executive Director External, a relatively new title. Give him a double clap for his increased responsibilities. He now has to make sure that HKMA and Hong Kong play a really successful role in international capital, even more successful, and that there is strong mainland Hong Kong cooperation. Only a small job. He will have no problem doing that. I still remember the first time you contacted me at an event years ago, and the conversation has been, I'm getting exciting, is the only way to put it. And lastly, for this session, Megumi Muto, who is Vice President, Development Finance, Mobilization of Capital, and many other things from JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And there's a special reason why Megumi's on the stage with us today, which is the elephant of Japan has started to move. In the last 3 years, we have seen commitments to 2030 as well as 2050 targets. We have seen METI, the extraordinary ministry that drove Japan's development in the 60s, commit to 1.5 degree and aggressive targets, and now to launch a green transformation or green transition plan, and soon to come to market with an annual program of $10 billion equivalent of issuance for green transformation bonds. It's very exciting. It's very exciting. We have China, we have Japan, we have Europe, we have Hong Kong. We have Singapore too, somewhere down there, don't we? But anyway, you get the idea. The world is changing. A few words just to set the scene, if I may, to get us going. You kind of know what the challenge is. We've been talking about this for a long time. We do need to understand things are getting tough. At Sharm el-Sheikh at the COP, it became very clear to me that we are losing the fight on climate change. The World Meteorological Agency said just 3 days ago that we will now see warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2027 or 2028, a few short years away. When you listen to climate scientists talking about the implications of that, it is frankly terrifying. Frankly terrifying. We cannot stop that now, it's too late. Our goal globally is to stabilise and bring down temperatures with very large-scale sequestration activities in the 2030s, whether that be forestry growth, soil activity changes, the great potential for sequestration is farming, different forms of farming, or whether it be direct air capture, which have now seen getting triggered underway in the US by the IRA, with subsidies for these sort of things. There are many other areas of sequestration. We will need to do that. We've got no choice. If we do this properly, we have a chance of getting emissions back down very quickly and warming back down to 1.5. That's the target. But let's be clear, it's a stretch goal. At the moment, we're on trajectory to get 2 degrees in the 2030s and then to quickly escalate to 4 to 5 to 6 degrees. You do not want your children to live in that world. It is not a world where the civilization that we enjoy now has much chance. They're the stakes. We, of course now, because we're starting to feel the impacts of climate change, and it's going to get worse very quickly because things are accelerating, have to prepare. So we need a resilience agenda as well now. Think of Sichuan last summer, the incredible heat, and of course the lack of water in the Three Gorges Dam and what that meant for power generation and being able to turn on the air conditioning. Or Pakistan last summer with the floods. These will become the new normal. We can, if we prepare, anticipate, minimise loss of life and maximise our chance to bounce back from these kinds of crises. So I do want to park with you an agenda for resilience. We will be doing much more work in the next couple of years on what that means, a resilience taxonomy to extend the taxonomy work that you've seen so far and you're going to hear about a bit today. The cost, well, it's not a cost. It's an investment. The investment required to address all of these things, according to McKinsey's, on the mitigation side is $9.2 trillion US a year globally. And we have at least 50% of that on the resilience side. These are vast sums. These dwarf the capacity of any government to be able to mobilise public capital, including the Chinese government, as Ma Jun wrote in a paper in 2016, identifying how much we need to give the private sector to support the Chinese government's change ambitions. We have some good news. We've got 3 wins I want to tell you about. The first win is that we do have the investor attention globally. It's extraordinary. Green bonds, climate bonds, resilience transition bonds get oversubscribed. I've had meetings all week with asset owners and fund managers in Hong Kong and that other little city down south in South China Sea, talking about the challenges that they understand that are facing portfolios, that they want to be able to shift their portfolios to invest in green and climate solutions. Of course, they still need the risk yield requirements because they're paying our pensions, right? They have to be able to make sure they get a return. But the appetite to move is extraordinary. We have $130 trillion US in the hands of institutional investors around the world before we get to other classes of investors. We have more capital on the planet than ever before in the history of humanity. And large parts of it are in places not earning much interest. Japanese government bonds, for example, have not got a good yield. A lot of those investors could do more if they're investing in green transition in ASEAN, getting a slightly higher interest rate and improving the chances of paying the pension of Megumi when she finally retires in 20 years' time. As you can see, the opportunity to mobilise capital is there. It's been proven by the green bond market, the resilience market, and of course now the transition bond market. We have the evidence. We just need more. And I'm going to say my main job now is drumming up supply. I wander around the world talking about needing more bonds issued because, frankly, we could place $10 trillion tomorrow morning. Tracy, can you find them for us? The appetite is there. That's the good news. The second good news is the extent to which regulators are moving and central banks. We have the Network for Greening the Financial System, of which Dr. Ma Jun was one of the first people, the founders of it when he was at the PBOC. PBOC was the initial member. Now 120 plus central banks. We have HKMA doing all of this stuff. Ken's going to tell us a little about it in the meantime, in a little while. We have regulators around the world engaging on how we address the risks facing the financial system of not taking action, the risks of impact, and the opportunities to act which will improve the health of our financial system going forward if we take the opportunity. It is about risk, clearly. And now we have incentives. We have the People's Bank of China exploring a variety of incentives to support green bonds, which have been in place for years and have underpinned the growth of the green bond market in China, now the world's second largest green bond market, or largest, depending on how you count the figures. We have, of course, the Indian central bank. We're working at the Reserve Bank of India now, who brought in green for public sector lending and looking at various other inducements. And we even have the Netherlands Central Bank doing the other side, who have banned loans to energy inefficient buildings by Netherlands banks. It's happening everywhere. There's a movement. Next, though, the big next is transition. We have to shift our economies. What the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us about what we need to do is extraordinary. Human society has never had change this severe on a global level that we are now asked to pursue. We have in different countries, in war usually, but we're talking about a global transition. We have the soup for this transition coming together in such an exciting fashion. The story of PBOC, the story of Chinese policy, the story of the European Commission, where I'm an expert advisor, and what they're doing now, the story in Singapore, in Hong Kong, the story of banks from JICA, from IFC to Standard Chartered and other major banks around the world. We have the soup coming together. How do we ensure that we bring this all together to achieve our targets? And remember, our targets are 55% cut in emissions by 2030, according to the IPCC, 60% by 2035, I remember, and net zero by 2050, and at the same time, prepare for the impacts of climate change that are going to be very severe. Typhoons in Hong Kong will be twice as intense in about 15 years. That's going to mean some significant changes to being able to survive those things going forward. That's transition. This year and next year is the window we have to plan. We now need to make sure everyone is planning. And then we're going to have till 2030 to implement. Well, at least that's my pitch. I'll see what my speakers think. Thank you everyone for being here. But first I do have to say thank you especially to our sponsors, because this doesn't happen without sponsors. To Hong Kong Stock Exchange, what a great venue. To Standard Chartered, who have been our primary sponsor for this whole event. And also to Myotech ESG Data and CCX, the Green Finance, one of our key partners in China, supporting verification, development of green finance plans, and now transition plans. Let me take a seat. Dr. Majun, can I ask your thoughts, reflections on this whole business of transition? What's happening?
Thank you, Sean. It's been so good to be sitting together. We haven't done that in the past 3.5 years, even though we started discussion almost 10 years ago in Guiyang. Transition finance, as I just mentioned to you, it's so important to look at this global framework, which was developed by G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group last year. We spent roughly 9 months last year within the group, involving more than 100 people and a lot of external advisors, and came up with this framework, which was endorsed by G20 leaders in November last year when they meet for the summit in Bali, Indonesia. And just spell out a little bit of the key components of the framework. There are 5 key pillars under the G20 framework for transition finance, which aims to mobilize a huge amount of private sector money for transition activities, namely carbon-intensive sectors like steel, cement, petrochemical, moving towards net zero. And we need to make sure we raise a large amount of money. At the same time, it's generally moving towards net zero in a transparent, scientific way. That's why the 5 pillars are all necessary, important. Number 1, we need to clearly identify the transition activities in some way. We debated on the methodology, and some countries like US and Japan say they want to go for principle-based approach. China and EU and many others are looking at the taxonomy-based approach, which means that in China, at least, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on PBOC approach. It's going to be a transition taxonomy. What does
Sorry, this is news? There's a transition taxonomy coming?
The PBOC has been drafting the transition taxonomy initially for 4 sectors: coal-fired power generation, steel, cement, and agriculture. I've been involved in the drafting process, and just last week I hosted an internal meeting for consultation on all of these. So it's been effort that's going on. How what does this transition taxonomy contain? It's just a huge table with all these carbon-intensive sectors, steel, cement, petrochemical, and so on. Each of them have a couple of pathways towards net zero, which are recognized by national, science and the technology experts, which obviously will also require them to meet certain carbon reduction targets in order to qualify in the transition taxonomy. And also within China, being proposing that the taxonomy should not be used in a standalone fashion. It has to be combined with a guideline for usage, which will actually adopt a lot of the other G20 principles under the other pillars. The second pillar the G20 framework proposed is disclosure of transition activities. And that disclosure is more complicated than green bonds because it's a whole process towards net zero rather than a single sort of point of time activity disclosure. And that's why this G20 principles are fairly complex on disclosure. Number one, we ask the entity, namely the company, receiving transition finance, to disclose. In fact, they need to develop, then disclose the transition plan to a net zero with short-term, medium-term, and long-term targets, which are science-based, and need to disclose the emission data, Scope 1, Scope 2, and if possible, Scope 3, and also the governance structure, which will make sure that they deploy the resources at a subsidiary level properly and monitor the progress of the decarbonization. The third pillar is the financial instruments. So far, we've been seeing a lot of debt-related instruments, such as sustainability-linked bonds and loans, but we also need a lot more equity and insurance-like products. The key thing that G20 said is, in fact, we need to building the incentive in the products to encourage the company to decarbonize as much as possible. So some sort of awards and penalties for performance and lack of performance we need to be building. And the fourth pillar are the incentives. The government needs to do something. The fiscal authority, the monetary authority, the sectoral regulators, to make many of these transition projects and entity bankable. Because most of them actually not looking bankable when the banks come and look at these, too much risk, right? And very high default rates. Let's reduce the risk and enhance expected return after risk adjustment. That's what the government should do with a whole bunch of incentives. And finally, making sure the financial sector is taking part in the just transition process. Not just leaving the just transition, for example, employment protection to the fiscal authority, because in most developing countries, I think fiscal capacity is simply not enough to protect the potential laid-offs from the transition process. And therefore, the financial sectors, including the banks, investors, needs to also think about ways to be engaged. And we specifically proposed the idea of the finances asking the company in transition to assess the impact of transition on employment. Are you going to lay off a lot of people? If you do, then you have to do something. For example, reskilling and retraining program. If you have such program, the finances need to award them by giving them a little bit lower cost funding. So that's a structure under the G20 framework.
And how much of this is now being applied in China? Again, with this huge transition challenges, just transition, not just mitigation transition.
Right. This whole framework is actually more complicated than the pure green finance system, which we developed 7-8 years ago in China. And we need to start with taxonomy, which the PBOC is now drafting. And also at the local level, we had Huzhou municipality drafted 2 versions of taxonomy. Right. One was out 1 year ago, and second one will be released, I think, within a month. And we need to really guide the companies to develop a transition plan. So some sort of a guidance notes are being drafted to show them the template of a transition plan and for specific sectors. And also incentive need to be put in. For example, Huzhou has put in incentives like guarantees and interest subsidies for transition projects. So all these are being experimented already.
So this is happening now?
It's happening now. It's an ongoing process.
Whoa, things are moving, everyone. It's not just abstract, is the key point about this. So what's next in this development, do you see, with transitions and transition plans?
Now, on the taxonomy side, I think the PBOC is now sort of consulting the private sector and also the other ministries. We 8 years ago, we had 7 ministries, working together.
And there can be differences of view between the ministries, as we know in China.
So need to convince the other ministries really on, the specific contents of the document, and hopefully, come up with this taxonomy and with the user guidance as quickly as possible. That's by far the most important to laying the foundation for transition finance. Then the financial sector will have to get prepared, coaching the companies to develop transition plan. Otherwise, we'll end up with a big document from central bank without much of a viable projects from the companies. And also disclosure need to be in place. Namely, all the companies that are applying for transition finance needs to have their scope 1, scope 2 ready, and also being prepared for scope 3. So all these are groundwork that need to be laid out, as quickly as possible.
Last question, because this is my segue to Ken. Common ground taxonomy, where are we at?
Yeah, this is another, our favorite subject. Sean and the CBI has been deeply involved in this on the European side. Back almost 4 years ago, we developed the idea of developing a common taxonomy between China and Europe, the 2 largest green bond markets, so that we don't segment the market and artificially blocking cross-border green finance flows. And we started this working group under the IPSF about 3 years ago, which I co-chaired with Marcel Hug from the European side. And the EU has used the CBI as an expert, and we have a whole bunch of Chinese experts joining the group. So by middle of last year, we came up with a revised version of the Common Ground Taxonomy Phase 1, which now includes 72 activities in the climate mitigation space that are recognized both by China and EU. And it's being used. I think as many as 10 issuers has issued green bonds internationally and some domestically, including through Standard Chartered, to place in the international market using Common Ground Taxonomy as a label. And the second usage of CGT is to apply them to existing or legacy Chinese bonds. This is an effort the China Green Finance Committee has been organizing last few months. And we have the CFAS, which is taking the lead to label some of the 1,000 plus legacy Chinese bonds using CGT. And 5 verifiers are engaged in this process. And hopefully within 1 or 2 months, they will publish the list of 200 plus Chinese legacy bonds that are qualified with CGT. And these 200 plus will be made available to the rest of the world instantly, because they're recognized by really the CGT, which is part of the EU taxonomy. And you can develop products on top of 200 something, making them green bond fund or ETF products and so on. The next phase, which started May 30, just a little more than a week ago in the CGT working group meeting, which I chaired with Marcel Hug, we decided to move towards phase 2. Phase 2 will do 3 things. Number 1, expanding the country basis of CGT. Right. Currently, it's based on China and European taxonomy. In the future, it will be based on more countries and jurisdictions taxonomy, such as Singapore. So Singapore has officially joined the CGT. And the second direction is to expand activities. So far, the 72 are for climate mitigation only, but we need more. For example, adaptation, environment, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. And third effort is capacity building, because a lot more countries need taxonomy, and we need to share the experiences of the CGT group with them and helping them to develop something that could potentially use CGT as a building block.
And in support of all of this, the European Commission is rolling out a sustainable finance hub with some investment support behind it too for emerging market green bond issuance, and we'll look at the transition. There's a live conversation at the European Expert Platform about how to put more detail into the transition narrative that's already part of the EU taxonomy, responding a little bit to these kinds of conversations. As you can see, it looks like there's a lot happening and they're uncoordinated, but there's a remarkable degree of talking between different jurisdictions going forward. Well, at least I think that's the case. Let's ask Ken. You've just released the taxonomy.
That's correct. Yeah. We really just literally last week released a consultation discussion paper on the Hong Kong taxonomy, which is building on what Martin said just now, the EU-China Common Ground Taxonomy. I think the common ground taxonomy is really very consistent with how Hong Kong see ourselves. We always see ourselves as the connector between mainland China and the rest of the world. And the common ground taxonomy serves the same purpose, making sure that investors in Europe, in the rest of the world, would be able to seamlessly invest in mainland China, which, as you all know, is a big, is a big destination of green investment. And what we've proposed in the discussion paper is a prototype taxonomy, setting out some thoughts on the definition of the different activities. I think we list out 10 in 4 key categories that are relevant to Hong Kong, property development, transportation, energy generation, and that. So the idea is really to try to see how we can operationalize common ground taxonomy. Dr. Ma mentioned the various bonds that have been using common ground taxonomy, but what we want to do is to institutionalize it so that people, everyday issuers, including potentially the Hong Kong government in the future, could really use that for issuance, and then kind of realizing that vision of bringing capital from across the world using the same standard.
And being a bridge between China and the rest of the world through that process.
Yeah.
Of course, one of your specific responsibilities, I understand, is Greater Bay Area financial flows. Tell us a little bit about what's happening there and how this links into our conversation about green and transition.
Yeah. Well, Greater Bay Area clearly is an area of huge economic size, and given we have Shenzhen, we have Hong Kong, basically a good combination of both technology as well as finance. So that could potentially drive the whole green transition in mainland China. What we've been using Greater Bay Area to do is really to experiment and set example. For example, we know that a lot of the financing in mainland China would have to come from international investment. We talk about the common ground taxonomy, but we also want to bring issuers to Hong Kong to make sure that they can tap into international capital. So over the past few years, we've seen notably Shenzhen government coming to Hong Kong twice, issuing green bond, issuing sustainable bond, tapping into that market. So that's one key area. I know Tracy is here. She will be able to talk more about the kind of sector-specific, real estate, power generation, all these sector-specific work that the Green Finance Association is doing in conjunction with the Greater Bay Area Green Finance Association. Added to that is also the fact that this is a huge market, so potentially we could use that to try out some of the regulatory or supervisory work that we've been doing. We talk about the common ground taxonomy, so clearly that's an area that we could potentially attract issuers to use this framework for issuance, so to set examples.
And when you say a model for China, I mean, how far are you pushing this envelope? I mean, isn't Shanghai the model for China, or actually Huzhou, or isn't Beijing? I mean, how does this fit within the discussions with the centre of Beijing and so on? Give us more flavour of that. I want about the ambition. What does it look like?
Well, I think that's very much consistent with how Hong Kong see ourselves versus other mainland hubs, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, and all those. We allow the mainland to access international capital. Shanghai obviously is a very big financial market. It serves the onshore market well, likewise in Shenzhen and Beijing as well. So it's really serving very different function, connecting, Hong Kong connecting mainland and the rest of the world, where Shanghai more kind of serving the local market. That said, there are kind of interesting interactions. So for example, in carbon trading, mainland obviously they have the local pilot scheme, but they also have a centralized scheme in Shanghai. We in Hong Kong, the exchange also introduced Core Climate, which is a voluntary trading platform. But the idea is that at some point we need to think about how the two would interact, how Hong Kong can use the Core Climate platform to allow international investors, potentially mainland manufacturers, carbon credit generator, to tap into the international market. So that's something that, an ongoing topic that we've been kind of thinking about.
Okay. I may add a couple of points on top of what Ken is saying in terms of, where Hong Kong actually can be leading compared with some of the mainland cities. I think number one is ISSB adoption, the International Sustainability Standard Board. And I'm expecting Hong Kong to adopting that earlier than mainland China. And you know that 70% of market cap here are actually Chinese companies. If these major Chinese companies listed in Hong Kong begin to utilize ISSB to report, then it can be a very good demonstration to the rest of the Chinese listed companies, those in the Asia market, on how to do this, right? And the feasibility of that and cost, may be contained rather than, as what they currently expect. The second thing is the ESG products. The mainland Chinese financial system is largely, bank-based system, and that's why we have a huge amount of green loans. Now it's 25 trillion, by far the largest in the world. But the ESG products in the asset management sector are relatively less developed. Hong Kong has a much more developed asset management, industry, which can certainly take a lead on developing credible ESG products. And finally, it's a carbon market, really, what Ken was saying. Hong Kong now has a marketplace for international voluntary carbon market trade, which mainland China can utilize and to channel some international financing to the mainland projects which can reduce carbon.
So there's a lot. I've had conversations with the Guangdong Finance Bureau about being very keen to be internationally aligned. So clearly you've got the regulators and the governments all aligned in places. What's your biggest challenge now?
Well, I think before going to the biggest challenge, we can think about some of those that are probably not, probably more surmountable. So Dr. Ma talked about the various pillars that we have to do to achieve transition finance, for example. Obviously, for things like taxonomy, where in addition to the challenge of having a common definition of what is green across the world, you still have to define the trajectory. So that probably takes time. But there are some additional issues, additional areas that we can probably do now. ISSB is a good example. To have good disclosure, but once we have good disclosure, then we would be able to assess whether certain activity, certain company is green, and we can use that same information to assess whether that same company is really, riding on the trajectory, the transition trajectory. So there are commonalities that we can do now while we kind of build on the transition taxonomy. Likewise, products. A lot of the products are actually, rather agnostic as to whether we're working towards the green goal or whether we're working towards the transition goal. The kind of scheme that we're introducing, I think Dr. Ma talked about one of the pillars being incentive that the government can provide. We are already providing subsidy to encourage the issuance of green bond, the borrowing in green format, and we've also expanded it to cover the broader sustainability format as well. So transition would certainly be included. So all these work can actually be done now based on what we are or already know and are able to achieve. But the biggest challenge, I think definition is clearly one. It took us quite a long time to work out the definition, and we're already riding on the good work that Dr. Ma has been doing at the international level. So that's an area, particularly given that different jurisdictions, they have different end game, the timing is different, the trajectory is very different. So that's an area that I think more work needs to be done.
Of course, while we've been talking about the Chinese elephant stirring, the Japanese elephant, if I may say so, has over the last 3 years done an extraordinary change since we saw green bonds and engagement by METI and MOF in 2019. That's grown. Stronger targets, stronger ambition, the Prime Minister's personal setting of targets and so on. Megumi, tell us about that story, and tell us about the story, most importantly, you've been through with JICA and its relationship to ASEAN countries, because you've been driving this change in the middle of the institution. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm from JICA, which is a development finance institution embedded in a development agency of the Japanese government. So I come from a little bit different segment of the market. Let me just briefly tell about myself. In JICA, I was involved for a long in portfolio for the Philippines and Pacific. So my concentrations was what to do with these big typhoons, cyclones, adaptation. And then I had the chance to go to the Paris office and interact with EU, OECD, and everyone was talking about this Paris Agreement. I was there in 2015, and I was awash by this need for mitigation and 1.5. So with that mix, I came back to JICA and started doing environment work, as well as advising the Treasury on how to go with the bond issuing strategies. And we had this big dilemma. We started from social bonds. That's fine because we are a development agency. We have a pride for that. But then I pushed a little bit my Treasury colleagues to go further to green and then sustainability overall. That's the way to go, right? According to Singh. But then we knew that in our sovereign portfolio, legacy assets, we had ultra supercritical coal power plants, combined cycle power plants. For example, in Bangladesh, LDC, at the time of the planning, they were having blackouts, and we as a development agency really wanted to help the country. But then in the context of Paris Agreement, 1.5 in particular, we cannot leave that there. But then we cannot divest. And there was a real kind of like an internal conversation on how to position ourselves in this new development of the financial architecture towards sustainability, but at the same time having this relationship with our development partner countries, long-standing, what to do with it. Okay. We haven't declared yet, but there's an emerging consensus within ourselves that we will not divest, but accelerate engagement for transition. Our strength at the development agency is that we have a tool, which is technical assistance for sectoral master plans. So like 5-year plans, 10-year plans, or even longer term plans on how to deploy investments in, for example, the power sector. So, for example, for our biggest, I would say, LDC portfolio, Bangladesh, my young colleagues, enthusiastic colleagues, started on a new integrated energy and power master plan with considerations about energy, or I should say energy security, safety, economic efficiency, affordability, as well as reducing greenhouse gas and other environmental negative impacts, showing business as usual or the net zero scenario and somewhere in between. And my colleagues are now in intensive consultations with the Bangladeshi authorities. So that's the engagement that we are working on. And I think that's really expected as a development finance institution and development agency. And I think Moody's, when they were looking into our social sustainability bond framework recently, they recognized this effort when they formulated the opinion for our sustainability bond. And thanks for all these cooperations, we successfully launched a 1.25 billion sustainability bond just last month. Thank you for that. So that has been our journey.
But the most important part, apart from your bond, is the extent to which you're now working with emerging markets to support them in transition, which is exactly what we need every single development finance institution to do. I mean, we'll hear a little bit in the last session from Leslie Musdorp, and we'll see if the new development bank is actually doing this lot. We'll find out later. We have another talk later on. But this is incredible. Now, has this been, is this a surprise to you, the extent to which you now have engagement in Japan domestically in a short period of change? And what do you think have been the key underpinnings, the features of why that change happened in Japan?
Okay. I think what has driven the transition in Japan is, in a nutshell, nudging and peer pressure. Maybe starting from this wearing masks and everything. I mean, in my cultural context, people are used to pushing a little bit one another and behave as a collective action. Okay. I think when the EU taxonomy, the first versions came out, there was alarm in METI, FSA, MOE, and mega banks recognizing that there should be some other thinking about non-disruptive, maybe a bit more orderly, we will like orderly things, scheme to, with a bit of accelerated peer pressure towards transition. So that was the initial thinking. So this transition finance framework was developed, benchmarked on a METI technology roadmap on how power and hard-to-abate industries are expected to transit in terms of technologies. I think it is very similar to what the G20 is discussing at this moment. So it is not like order, but it is guidance and market-driven peer guidance using all these third-party opinions, accreditations, market structures to make sure that the whole thing happens. Okay, with the same logic, the MUFG and McKinsey organized the Asia Transition Finance Study Group. Maybe some of you are on the table as well. To form a reference consensus on the technology transition in ASEAN countries and then formulate this concept of transition finance in ASEAN. In particular, there's support from the think tank of ASEAN, which is called AREA in Singapore. They are really helping out in supporting the formulation of the technology roadmap. But of course, the taxonomies of the individual countries are left to the country ownership. At the beginning of this the study group, Asia the Transition Finance Study Group, we were not invited because maybe the people outside were thinking, okay, JICA is the face of the fossil finance of Japan, so let's not invite. But I, without hesitation, jumped in. Okay,
Good
we
on
have
you.
to change.
And isn't that what we've all got to do, everyone? Jump in. Don't be shut out.
Yeah, and engaged younger, emerging leaders to come with me to jump into that conversation. So I'm the one who is like taking all these, checking who is attending to each study group, and I'm the mama of everything. Okay, so with that, now I have several directors who are already very equipped, ready to get engaged in the JETP discussions for Indonesia or Vietnam. And that's how we are now entering into this private and public partnership frameworks in each of the countries. And thank you very much for many of you to be in that JETP together. Thank you.
Fantastic. And of course, that's a whole new frontier of taxonomy, coal decommissioning activities. And a number of the banks here have been involved in it. We published the Climate Bonds Initiative with Climate Policy Initiative and RMI, coal decommissioning investment criteria a few months ago, and they've been taken up by the GFANs and others. And you will see, certainly in the Singapore taxonomy, MAS now planning to add that into the taxonomy published there, which is really important. What is that? It's about shutting down coal plants early. Very simple. This, of course, is going to end up being important in Japan and in China by the time we're finished. But the discussion's underway in Vietnam, especially Indonesia, South Africa, and other countries. So there's a lot to be done, right? But before I go on, I want to ask you in the audience if you've got any questions of our superstar on the panel. I'd like to take 3 questions quickly. We've got a couple of people wandering out of microphone. I'm getting my glasses so I can see people left over here. Just to kick us going. Please, 30 seconds. Do it short and sharp.
Thank you for sharing your experience and your wisdom. With regards to the work of JICA and Bangladesh specifically, similar to the Development Cooperation Agency of Japan, the German Development Corporation, the Americans, they have also been investing in Bangladesh on the industry level, on the demand side. Is there some interaction that JICA is planning with those associations? Because they are now planning to have 120 million for offshore wind, yeah? And if the panel could reflect on how there will be the link between this taxonomy and the alignment of the ratings of what the companies are doing. Thanks.
We'll take a few questions. You can pick the ones that are relevant. Please, in the front here.
Thank you. I'm from GBA Carbon Neutrality Association. So we would like to ask whether it's the trend to get the company green bond. And also in Hong Kong, we have the green bond tokenization. If we can do it, it is not right now in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, is another trend. We can issue the company green bond and make it tokenization. Thank you.
Good question. I need a few more. One over here, please. And put your hand up over here on the side and a couple just behind you, Manshu. Please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm Jordan from UN Environment. So as I can see that from the COP27 in Egypt, actually there's a lot of discussions and a decision on loss and damage and its funding. So I would like to ask our panelists that whether there's some consideration and loss and damage funding. Thank you.
Please, stand up. And then someone here.
Thank you, Gong Cheng from the Bank for International Settlements. So one question on the nature-based taxonomy and also green finance. So where do are we standing now as regard to nature-based, especially given that all the acute disasters that are happening? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Chao-Ni from BNP and HKGFA. A question to the panelists on transition finance. I understand definition will take time, but I don't think we have the luxury of time to wait for 2 years to define what transition taxonomy looks like. So what's the role of private sector while we're waiting for the perfect definition? Thanks.
The perfect definition indeed. Two more questions. Put your hand up fast. One over there and one on this side. I'll pick someone out. I need another question.
Hi, I'm Sachin from Citigroup. On the topic of transition finance, and of course, definitions, which are so important, as the colleague there mentioned as well. I guess in the context of Asia, what's also really relevant is a just transition. And I'm just wondering, in the context of the taxonomies that we are defining, how do we build that in as well?
Good question. Any last? Thank you. Who would like to kick us off? Pick a question, pick an answer. Megumi, maybe I should start with you because the first question.
Thank you very much. I think I will take this question from the gentleman with regard to Bangladesh and then loss and damage. Okay, with regard to Bangladesh, how we are working on with the demand side, I didn't mention, but JICA is working on bank loans to support small and middle-sized companies to work on the building energy efficiency as well as machinery, industrial process energy efficiency. Because when we see the composition of potential CO2 reduction in Bangladesh, these two areas, industry and building, are huge. So that's one point. And then with regard to this collaboration with development partners, yes, World Bank, ADB, US, we are joining hands, but sometimes as we have limited resources, so we play our own roles, but coordination is always there. On the loss and damage, I think with regard to this precise definition on loss and damage, UNCCC process will go on with that definition in the coming year, I believe. But from JICA side, we are really promoting investment, ex-ante investment in disaster risk reduction measures. $1 of ex-ante investment, like in flood protection control, coastal management, will yield $7 to $10 of savings in terms of avoided future damages. So yes, the development community is really keen on increasing adaptation as well as DRR finance. But this definition of loss and damage, I think it's still in the UNCCC process. Thank you.
Thank you. Ken, any questions you'd like to answer?
Yep, maybe I pick on the two kind of market-focused questions. First is on the green bond trend as well as on tokenization. The trend of green bond is very clear. It's been growing very rapidly. I think Sean made some prediction a few years ago, and that the market clearly surpassed those predictions. Last year it was a difficult year, so there was some comeback by a little bit. But I think that shouldn't kind of overshadow the overall kind of long-term trend. One additional point I think is important is that bond is one source of financing, but that's not the only source. Dr. Ma mentioned that in this part of the world, bank loan is very important, and we do see that. So say, for example, when we administer the government's grant scheme, we see that over the past few months when the overall market, the overall bond market is a little bit unsure about interest rates and all that, sustainability-linked loan, green loan really gone up. So that's something that we should bear in mind as well. So from the corporate's perspective, they should also bear in mind that there are multiple channels. So just pick the one that really is the most suitable to you. Tokenization. We see great potential in tokenization from a general bond market perspective, the use of DLT technology, centralizing putting all the kind of information and transaction in one place promises to really enhance efficiency. And applying that in the green context as well, bulking on the kind of disclosure, real-time monitoring can address some of the greenwashing and reporting difficulties. But I think we also need to be realistic. The technology is still relatively new, despite everything that we've been hearing about virtual asset, blockchain, and all those, is probably quite a few years away from actual widespread implementation. So I would say focus on the conventional form first, while the more kind of regulator or the kind of people like the HKMA or JICA, the more experimental issue, we can kind of have a go at that first. The other question on what the private sector could do while taxonomies are being developed, I think that goes back to Dr. Ma and my earlier point about disclosure. Really, there is no single definition, but different investors, for example, the largest in the world, they already have their own assessment criteria. So to the extent there is sufficient information in the market, which if not already then, will soon be coming out with the TCFD disclosure deadline by 2025 in Hong Kong with the implementation of ISSB, for example. The private sector should be able to make their own decision. So I agree, don't wait. Please go ahead, and then we'll work on the taxonomy as fast as we could.
Yeah, let me touch upon two questions, one on nature, which is raised by our colleague from BIS, and one from Chowny on the speed of us moving towards a transition taxonomy. On nature, I think it's not just taxonomy. Nature itself needs to become a topic for governments, regulators, international organizations, and we're making progress in that direction. For example, a couple of years ago, when I was still in the NGFS, co-leading a study group on biodiversity and financial stability, we came up with a conclusion that the central banks and supervisors will have to care about nature and biodiversity, because if you don't care, it becomes a source of financial risk. And from a perspective of maintaining financial stability, the central bank and financial regulators have a responsibility to deal with this challenge and risk. So that was a starting point of reaching some sort of a global consensus of financing, taking care of nature. And this year, under the Indian presidency of G20, the G20 Sustainable Financing Working Group has included nature disclosure into its topic, which is the first step at the G20 level towards recognition of its importance. And I'm really hopeful that next year, under the Brazilian presidency of G20, we can include nature as a more prominent topic under the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, given that Brazil has made a commitment to protect Amazon, and the end of last year we have this COP15, which reached a consensus on global efforts towards protecting 30% of land and 30% of the ocean, and a lot more financing under this agreement will be needed towards protecting nature and biodiversity. So I think the G20 will have to do something bigger. And the whole framework of financing biodiversity will need to include biodiversity like taxonomy, biodiversity or nature-related disclosure and measurement of impact, and some policy incentive plus a lot more instruments that's suitable for financing nature and biodiversity. That's a short answer to your first question on nature. On transition taxonomy, it's interesting. You guys in the market can't wait, right? You want to do a lot of transition products and, still waiting for the government to come up with official taxonomy. I think there are a few sort of types of taxonomy we can adopt, at different pace. Private sector, just do it. I see a couple of banks have done their own taxonomy, and they're implementing these internal framework for identifying transition activities. And some, NGOs are doing this, like CBI. You're putting out your transition taxonomy, which is great, as an important basis for the national authorities and the international organizations to consider as a reference. These can move fast, and the local governments can move fast. As I said, the Huzhou municipality came up with a taxonomy for transition beginning of last year, and now they have the second version ready for release, and they can utilize that to mobilize the local support for financing local transition projects.
Supported by a mayor who can only be called a zealot for transition, who is so keen and so enthusiastic and so determined to make a change that he's empowering all his team to do stuff. It's a great example of leadership.
We
with
need
tools.
a lot more mayors like that.
Indeed.
So these entities can move within a few months, 6 months or something, and they come up with a transition taxonomy. But for the national authorities, central banks and regulators, they need to be very careful, because once it's done, they don't want to be challenged with so many loopholes, and that's why consultation here and there, it's going to take longer. And this is a reality. We really, not much can do. But for smaller economies, I think the one sort of a pathway which could be faster, which is CGT+. The Common Ground Taxonomy provides a basis for pure green activities. And if a small economy with not very complex economic structure, you only have a few sectors, for example, the properties in Hong Kong and the transportations in Hong Kong, which are large emitters, can we just do CGT+, 2 or 3 additional activity which are transitional, and put it out very quickly. But for very large economies with 96 industries, 70% of them are carbon intensive. It's very complex. We really need to go deeper into the technology. And finally, I think the private sector push is important. I know, Chowny, you've been leading our CGT work under the Hong Kong Green Finance Association. You've been underwriting a lot of these projects. But you should tell the government regulators, do it fast. We're waiting for you, and they will implement your stuff as soon as possible, and we can help you. If you don't have time to draft, we help you to draft. It's for free.
So keep an eye out on Chowny and Ken having a cup of coffee together after the session. Of course, there's a lot more happening in different areas with the just transition. The Japanese government, in its GX bond, has been looking at how to include some narrative and language around just transition and the allocation of proceeds. So this is becoming a common thing. Nature, I want to say, there's been a tendency to treat nature as a separate silo, as a separate activity. We need to understand that a strong and healthy nature biodiversity is a critical climate resilience investment. It's linked, it's an extension of what we need to do, the same way as transitions is. And so what we're working on is a broader resilience taxonomy, which incorporates social, nature, economic, the SDGs, if you like, with an evidence base to make it clear how critically important these measures will be to ensuring our societies and our people can survive what is going to be a century of extremities. Severe weather is coming on. So this is all, it's very much interrelated. I think that's the key to the climate conversation and the transition conversation. It's transition to low carbon. It's also transition to resilience, because the world has to change now. We've made our nest. We have to learn how to live with it going forward, and that's going to require a lot of changes. We need to wrap up. We're at the end of our session. I'd like to ask these really fabulous people, good friends, for some parting reflections and specifically advice to these crew out here, where they should go next. What are their learnings from your process in JICA, for example, Megumi? You have a room full of people who are keen to see change. That's why you don't turn up for a conference like this unless you're deciding that things have got to change. How do we go forward? Megumi, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you. I was thinking about our sustainability and climate journey, and I spotted that in several key instances, ladies were there.
Yes.
Yeah? Not just me, but also Ray.
Oh, Shoni, stand up. Oh, Tracy, stand up. Do you know how this industry is dominated by women? I mean, we're the rare ones.
The director in charge of the sustainability bond issuance is a lady. And then the one who is manager who is pushing the sustainability governance and the reporting now in JICA is a lady. So yeah, I mean, ladies will change the world. Thank you very much.
So I guess your advice is find a woman and put her in charge. Okay. So Ken, that's tough for you and I, but please, your advice to the audience.
Well, we talk about a lot of the very important issues today, transition finance and all those. But I think we also need to be realistic. I think with the kind of transition plan, greening plan that many governments have released, chances are, well, I think Sean also mentioned at the beginning that chances are we're going to miss the 1.5 degree deadline. What we want to do is to kind of bring it back, but we also need to prepare for the worst, which is, what if, we don't manage to bring the line back. And here, adaptation really is important. I think we talk about adaptation at the beginning, but this is something that we probably have to do in a more systematic manner. We, for example, in the government Green Bond Program recently added climate change adaptation as one of the use of proceed category, and probably something that's worth everyone thinking about a little bit more.
Great advice.
I'd like to mention the importance of a private-public sector partnership. It's not an abstract concept. In fact, it worked so well in the past 10 years in China and other places. You remember in 2014-15 when I was leading the drafting group of the China Green Finance Guideline, we involved so many private sector guys, including foreigners like you, right? Simon Zadek and so on. And we have 14 working groups, and most of these are headed by private sector specialists.
Yep.
And they actually worked for the PBOC to jointly develop the Green Finance Guideline. Without the private sector capacity, initiative, and pressure, it's impossible to do something like that. And the same thing I think for many other jurisdictions. Shawnee been complaining about the regulators and governments not coming things quickly enough. It's just a matter of a partnership. The government needs to be pressured so that it can move faster. The government needs to be equipped with private sector resources, and all these things require better form of private-public sector partnership.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Exactly right. So if you are in the private sector out there, part of your job is to press the public sector, especially investors and the major banks who can see what needs to happen. Now, it's very difficult as an individual agency to make a financing decision if no one else is doing it, especially if you're an investor. We need to have a rising tide. The only way we get a rising tide is if governments take action to make sure the rule sets and so on are across the board, and it's just not to one investment manager or one bank to lead the way. That's the secret, but it is that collaboration, which is, of course, the Japanese story at the moment. The GX program is an intense collaboration. Lessons to be learned, and I'm going to say lessons to be taken back from my perspective to the US and to Europe. Asia will show us the way. Thank you for our speakers. Thank you, Marjun. Thank you, Kenneth Huey. Thank you, Megumi Muto. And please give them a big clap. I'd like to invite, while we're getting a photo opportunity here, I'd like to invite my next moderator, Wen Hong. Please come to the stage. Wen Hong is our China manager for climate bonds, who's going to moderate. Go over here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much.